All right, I'd like to thank the organizers for this wonderful conference and for getting me out of setting up chairs at the Stake Center this morning. And thank you to all of you for showing up on a Saturday morning to support this. My title, In the Fields and in the Forest, comes straight from the book of Mosiah, chapter 20, verse 8. The context is that Limhi is on his tower, probably a tower that his father Noah had built, and he sees the Lamanites approaching from the land of Shemlon, I believe, and he sets his people in the fields and in the forest to lay in wait for them. Now, as a Mesoamericanist, this language sort of jumps out at me. The contrast between field and forest is one of the organizing principles in Mesoamerican cosmology. Ordered human space, whether it's a field or a house or even a corn granary or a city itself, or even in some sense the larger Mesoamerican landscape. They would contrast this with concepts of wilderness. Wilderness is a scary place. For the Aztec, that's where the Chichimec originated. They were the wild, ferocious hunter-gatherers that wore nothing but skins until they ended up founding the city of Tenochtitlan after following their patron god, Huitzilopochtli. And there will be a quiz on all these names at the end, by the way. There's a classic ethnography called Chancom from a Yucatecan village. And I have a lot of quotes on here, and I know some of you are far back and you're probably angry that I'm using text, but I will read these for you, and hopefully I project enough that you can hear. In Maya thought, the quadrangular milpa is compared to four-sided houses, towns, and other forms of socially constructed human space. Thus, among the Yucatec, the world, the village, and the milpa, cornfield, are thought of as squares with four corners lying in the four cardinal points of the compass and with defined central points. In other words, these are all architectural cosmograms. You've got the cosmos itself is quadrangular. You've got four corners and you've got a center point, an axis mundi. Now I should mention, I'm assuming that all of you have read all of my articles about Mesoamerican ritual loci and ritual specialists and deification and syncretism, and I'm gonna kind of pull a Hugh Nibley and just pick up where I left off. So I apologize for that, but that's where we're at. Even modern Maya continue to make these cosmograms. They order their social space according to ancient principles. They no longer build the massive pyramids like they used to, but they'll make these out of wattle and daub, out of sticks and out of mud, and yet the organization is essentially the same. They'll have inner sanctums, as it were, space where only the reigning priest can enter into, as it were. Anciently, they had a formal organized priesthood as well. The king himself was an ex officio high priest. In other words, by virtue of his office, he was the ranking high priest. And there's certain locations where only he could enter. Now we start seeing this development of restricted space in a much more pronounced degree in what's known as the Preclassic period. Now the Book of Mormon takes place solidly in the Preclassic, in the Middle Preclassic and the Late Preclassic. And it's during this period that we start getting more of these monumental structures. This is the Danta Pyramid Complex at El Mirador. In terms of cubic meters of material, it's larger than the Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt. This is a massive structure. I've flown over this area in a helicopter. If you want to hike there, it takes 3 days, and you have to pack up a burro And if you didn't notice on my way up, I'm not much one for hiking through the wilderness. And so I'm more of the helicopter type. And for years, it's just unbroken forest, and pilots used to navigate by what they thought was a little natural hill. And then, some 50 years ago, somebody decided to actually check it out, and they're like, hey, that's a pyramid. And BYU was part of the original excavations. It's now under the directorship of Richard Hansen. They've been digging there for 40 years, and we've barely scratched the surface. Thanks to the new LiDAR imagery, some of you have probably seen some of the stuff coming from National Geographic just in recent weeks even. And we've bumped up our population estimates, and the Mirador Basin, we think, probably had 1 million people in it, just in the Mirador Basin in the Preclassic period. Now, what we're looking at here, you have to hike upstairs just to get to this first plaza area. And then you've got a very big hike to get up to the top of this temple. And then if you want to actually get to the temple structures themselves, you have to hike up even higher. And these structures on the top are what the actual pyramids are. These aren't hollow, there's nothing inside of them. It's the structures on top where the ritual activity would take place. They would very often, typically they would have an effigy, a wooden statue of the gods. And it wasn't just a representation of the god, it was the god. They believed that you could essentially embody gods through a particular ritual activity, not just into wood or stone, but into human vessels as well. The ruler was a living embodiment of the gods. I mentioned, I think we had a formal organized priesthood. The best evidence for that is from the Classic period. We've got some new murals that just were discovered in the last couple of years from the site of Shultun that show what they're referring to as an order of the priesthood, which perks up our ears. There were sumptuary laws that dictated what a person could wear. The poor people weren't allowed to wear jade. They couldn't wear fancy clothing. Even if a poor person were to find a jade necklace lying on the side of the road, they couldn't wear it because it was out of their class or out of their caste system. They would trade their jades from the interior to the coastal areas where they would have pearls, freshwater pearls, and from the swampy regions, I guess, and then actual saltwater pearls as well. And the Book of Mormon does mention that they had all manner of fine pearls, and I can't help but wonder if the fake jades, or the jades that they would carve into the shape of pearls would qualify as that. Now, the ruler and some of the high elites would engage in what are known as deity impersonation rituals, or deity embodiment rituals is a better way of thinking of it, where they would actually transform into that god. And it wasn't play acting. They really thought that for the moment of those rituals, they were embodying that god. They would typically do these in the royal palaces, in these constricted spaces, but occasionally they would do it apparently for public consumption as well. Now, King Noah, it says, had built him a spacious palace. Now, if he's a king in the Preclassic period, I think it's very likely that he is doing what kings do. And kings at this time are building palaces, they're restricting space, they're setting up their own formal organized priesthoods, and they're building beautiful thrones out of wood, out of stone. They're deciding whether captives get their heads cut off or whether they get released. It all just sort of fits, as it were. Not just narratively, but chronologically is a point that I think is important to keep in mind. Now, I want to jump forward a couple thousand years to the year 1722. We have an account from a Spanish historian, Spanish chronicler living in the area, And he says, it happened in this kingdom shortly after being conquered, that upon hearing the life of Christ, which the friars taught them, there arose a Mexican Indian, a pseudo-prophet. He taught them that Hunahpu, the elder of the hero twins of the Book of Mormon, I'm sorry, of the Popol Vuh, I'm getting ahead of myself, was God, and that Hunahpu, or in other words, Hunahpu, father of the hero twins, was the son of God. For this reason, there was such a commotion among the Indians that the work was nearly lost, for they came to imagine that our holy gospel told them nothing new. So, in other words, this pseudo-prophet was teaching that the father of the hero twins was the son of God, and that the son of the father in the Popol Vuh was actually God. Now this calls to mind Abinadi's really theologically complex teaching in Mosiah 15. And by theologically complex, most of us are like, what the heck is he talking about? And one thing we need to keep in mind, again, referencing my earlier work that I know all of you have read, concerning religious syncretism, and more particularly, deity complexes and multiple manifestations of deities. What this basically refers to is that you can have one God that has a lot of different manifestations. He might be a creator God, or a fertility God, or a rain God. But it's all sort of the same God, but he's manifesting these different attributes. And we do the same thing with Christ, right? We believe in a pre-mortal Christ who was a creator deity before he was embodied. We believe in a mortal Christ that was crucified and resurrected, that through his godship he was able to atone for our sins. We believe in a disembodied Christ, at least for 3 days, while he ministered in the spirit world, and then a resurrected, glorified Christ. Now, ontologically, these are, in some sense, very different beings. Unembodied versus pre-embodied versus mortally embodied versus immortally embodied. For the Maya, they would do the same thing. And again, this is imagery coming from the Preclassic period, around the time of the Book of Mosiah, some of these events. So here we see the Maize god, and this was in the inner sanctum of a temple, by the way, where you would get to the top of the temple, you would enter in, and you couldn't just peek and look at the back wall. This was, you had to walk in and then turn around, and it was the innermost wall in the most restricted space at the top of the tallest temple at the site of Sibal. And what we see is the Maize god wearing the headdress of the principal bird deity. Now, the principal bird deity is the avian manifestation of the god Itzamna, who is a creator deity, the supreme creator deity. So you have this creator god who sometimes is just shown on a throne sitting in his palace in the celestial kingdom. It's literally in the sky. And sometimes he appears as he's shown as a bird. And what we have here is the Maize god now wearing the headdress of the principal bird deity / Itzamna, meaning he is now embodying the attributes of that god, indicating his identification with the concept of the old god, Itzamna, the world tree, the axis mundi, and the supreme power of the creator. Alan Christensen says this: the Maya do not generally reject innovations and foreign influences outright, but structure them in such a way that they resonate with older indigenous patterns. The process of Aditeco myth-making and ceremonial practices is therefore one of accumulation, adding new elements to older traditions rather than replacing them. In other words, they would repurpose old imagery, old gods even. Now, if this seems strange, need to thank Brant Gardner for this insight, but if you look at early Christian art in the 2nd through 4th centuries AD, in the Roman Empire, there's a lot of persecution against Christians, so they couldn't just depict Jesus. So they would actually, I'm forgetting the god's name now. I don't know my Roman stuff at all. He plays a harp. The Apollo I'll get to in a second, but there's a Greek god that plays a harp, and he tries to resurrect his wife from the underworld, and he, anybody know who I'm talking about? Orpheus, thank you, Orpheus. So early Christians would draw a picture of Orpheus or look at a picture of Orpheus and say, that's Jesus. Now Orpheus is a mythological Greek poet, prophet from, we've got imagery at least, I think, 600 BC that we have accounts of him, and yet they are looking at pictures of Orpheus and saying, that's Jesus. They would do the same with Jonah. They would turn to Jewish mythology. Jonah, an obvious choice, because 3 days in the belly of a whale, Jesus 3 days in the earth. But they would look at a picture of Jonah, they would draw Jonah and think, that's Jesus. Or they would do the same with Daniel in the lion's den. Or they would draw pictures of peacocks and think, that represents Jesus. Why? Because for the Greeks, peacocks, their flesh didn't rot, at least that's what they said, was their flesh wouldn't rot after they died, so it's an obvious representation of Christ. Or the spots on their tail feathers were reflective of the all-seeing Christian God. And so again, they look at a peacock and think, well, that's Christ. And so the Maya would do the same thing. When they were introduced to Christian gods, and particularly Christian saints, coming from the Catholics, there's a whole array to choose from. They would just say, oh, well, that's, okay, Saint Michael, that's, that's the fire god, or San Antonio, or Mary is the mother goddess. And so they would just draw all these different analogies between these different gods. And it depends on which, it's not homogeneous across the Maya area. Every city sort of interpreted things in their own ways. The Nephites would do the same thing. When Ammon visits King Lamoni, he says, do you believe there's a God? Lamoni says, I don't even know what that means. He says, do you believe in the Great Spirit? Lamoni is like, oh yeah, of course. And Ammon says, oh, that's God. Now, in the Maya area, there's a distinction between celestial gods, the word for that is ku, and underworld gods, which is Y, or Wayov in the plural. Now here's where it gets really weird. Ammon said, do you believe that this great spirit who is God created all things which are in heaven and in the earth? And Lamoni said, well, I believe he created all things which are in the earth, but I don't know the heavens. Why? Because it's the great spirit, not the great God. Now what happens after they convert? Now I should point out the only people to ever mention the great spirit are Lamoni and his father and his brother, Anti-Nephi-Lehi. Pre-conversion, when Aaron's talking to the king of all the Lamanites, the king says, is God that great spirit that brought our fathers out of the land Jerusalem? And Aaron said, yes, he is the great spirit. After he converts, he says, I thank my God, my beloved people, that our great God has in goodness sent these our brethren, the Nephites, unto us. And I thank my great God that he has given us a portion of his spirit to soften our hearts. So he changes his belief in the great spirit to the great God. And this term great God is not common in the Book of Mormon. Now, Hunahau, who we mentioned earlier in the context of this pseudo-prophet, as Jimenez called him, has a lot of different associations. Now, we find some of these associations at some sites, some at others, some at early periods, some, particularly the last one, in very late periods. But Hunahau is basically the maize god. He's god of resurrection. We have at the murals of San Bartolo him resurrecting out of the earth. And these murals date to about 100 BC, by the way. He's also the god that offers his own blood on behalf of the people. He teaches sacrifice of beast and fowl. And we'll talk about the implications there when Amulek talks to the people of Antionum. He's also described as a suffering servant, which we won't have time to talk about, but in The Memory of Bones by Carl Taubes, Stephen Houston, and David Stewart, there's some great stuff about that. But he's clearly suffering. If it's not obvious what he's doing here, I won't explain it, but it would hurt. He's also compared to the world tree. And again, in the conquest era, and even today, he's likened unto Christ. In most Maya cultures across the region, Christ is the maize god is Christ. We see this in the highlands and the lowlands and everywhere in between. Now, the kings themselves believed that they were living embodiments of the Maize god, even apart from the specific moments of impersonation rituals. Now, what does that mean then for King Noah? Well, if he's in that cultural context, when in Rome, as they say, and do as the Romans do, he probably believes that he is an embodiment of God on earth. And if you think about the charge that's finally brought against Abinadi, if, we finally found something to charge you with, he said that God himself will come down. It's a future tense. Now, that's a problem if you believe that you are that God. And they said, we're going to put you to death unless you take back what you said about the king. It's not about what they said about God, it's about for reviling against the king. So let's look at some of the specific prophecies that Abinadi makes and put them in the context of Maya agriculture. He says it will be driven and scattered as a wild flock by wild and ferocious beasts. Again, from the San Bartolo murals, we have jaguars, our wild beasts, but they're chasing wild flocks, we should point out. Typically, when we think of flocks, we think of sheep because that's what's in the artwork. We don't have domesticated sheep anywhere in the New World. But we do have flocks of things like turkeys, which are domesticated. We've got a domesticated variety and a non-domesticated variety. Jaguars would hunt deer and everything else in between. But look on YouTube sometime and watch videos of wild deer herding wild turkeys, and it's kind of fun. What else does he prophesy? This one is super speculative, I admit. But it's my opinion, but as you all know, that's usually right. It's a total joke, by the way. My wife can confirm that. Here we have the Mexican prickle poppy. It's the Argemone mexicana. It's one of the only thistles that we find in the Mesoamerican region. It slows crop growth. It disperses in the wind, and it's poisonous. You read the literature. It says, cattle do not graze the plant as it is spiny, but they can be poisoned if they consume it in hay or the chaff. Now in Mosiah 12:12, we get this very interesting language. It doesn't occur anywhere else in Scripture. It says, thou shalt be as the blossoms of a thistle. That appears nowhere else in Scripture. Which when it, meaning the thistle itself, not the blossom, is fully ripe, if the wind bloweth, it is driven forth upon the face of the land. And how does this occur? Well, if my people sow filthiness, they shall reap the chaff thereof in the whirlwind, and the effect thereof is poison. Poison, chaff, thistle. It all sort of makes sense, right? We've got an east wind. Carrie Hull, who's in the audience today, has an article or a chapter in a book that just came out about Abinadi. It's called Abinadi, He Came Among Them in Disguise, published by the Religious Studies Center. And he talks about how the east wind can, in Mesoamerica, depending on where you're at in Mesoamerica, it can either be hurricane winds or it can be desiccating winds. I think it's probably the desiccating winds because it talks about how King Noah will be as a dry stalk in the field, which the beasts come and trample. And what the Maya do when the maize is ripe, they bend it over, they break it, and then they allow the beasts to come in. In our modern day, they allow cattle to come in to trample on the field. Deer will come in. Peccaries will come in. The deer will feed on the stubble. The peccaries will actually eat the dried corn stalks, much to the chagrin of the owner of the milpa or the cornfield. But here it also says, I will send forth hail among them, and it shall smite them. And they shall also be smitten with the east wind, and insects shall pester their land also and devour their grain. This is from the Codex Borgia, page 28, and it's really hard to see it. It's blurry, I apologize. But what we see here is the corn is dried out, and a scene next to this, it's because of hail. It shows flints raining down, basically, and then we have little insects eating all of the grain. All of the pestilences, all of the destruction that we read about in Abinadi's prophecies against Noah are actually represented there in the Borgia. 1 minute? Yeah. Okay, let's see how that goes. Now this is from the book of Helaman, but I couldn't resist. When the devil shall send forth his mighty winds and his shafts in the whirlwind, yea, when all his hail and his mighty storm shall beat upon you. So we get a little bit of parallelism, which is very common in Mesoamerican literature. We get the mighty winds with the mighty storm, and whirlwind is paired with hail. We get this same couplet in the Ritual of the Macaques, which is a colonial Yucatec document with healing rituals in it. And we get this language: 13 is my great hailstorm, with which I extinguish your force. 13 is my great whirlwind, with which I extinguish your force. So we have this pairing of hailstorm and whirlwind. In the Bible, hail in the context of hard rain occurs something like 32 times, and whirlwinds occur something like 37 times, but they never occur in conjunction with each other as a couplet. So this is a couplet that's unique to Mesoamerica and to the Book of Mormon. What else has it been that I prophesy? You shall suffer even as I suffer the pains of death by fire. The Maya would burn their cornfields as part of their ritual, but also part of the agricultural process. Carrie Hull and I have an article together in that same book about Abinadi, talking about his death and how it was very likely that he's being put to death by torches, pine torches, bundles of pine torches that they would press against the skin to char the skin and then beat them to scrape it away. And then keep doing that over and over and over until they finally succumb to death. Now, very, very briefly, when Alma and Amulek and the all-star team of missionaries, all of whom were Nephite elites, by the way, princes or former judges or wealthy individuals from Ammonihah or the sons of such, the Zoramites are troubled because they've been cast out of their synagogues. Now, this may seem anachronistic. In 1828, the word synagogue simply meant a congregation of Jews. So what do Alma and Amulek preach to a people that are sad because they've been cast out of their synagogues and who don't believe in the Son of God? Those are the two concerns that Amulek specifically says they're troubled by. So they quote Zenos, who says, you can worship anywhere, in your wilderness, in this wild, chaotic space, in your field, in your house, in your closet. This has parallels to both Mesoamerican temple structural layouts, as well as to the Temple of Solomon, outer court, inner court, temple structure itself, the inner sanctuary. And synagogue, by the way, the word synagogue, again, just means congregation. And in that, when they're quoting Zenos, he says, thou hast heard me when I was in the midst of my congregations. In other words, in the midst of my synagogues, and when I was cast out. I'll make one final point here. The Maya would grow, not just the Maya, but across Mesoamerica and even in the American Southwest, they would grow different varieties and different colors of corn for ritual purposes. They would not grow their white corn in the same field as their yellow corn, and the white corn was sort of extra special. The word white in Mayan languages means, the word Tzuc means white or clear or pure, and it has reference to new life. The word Tzuc means to germinate, to sprout, light breaking through darkness, an act of creation. There's all of these ideologies wrapped up in it. Now, with this white corn, they would make a corn drink called Tzuc. It literally means white water, but they would sweeten it with honey. So it was extra sweet, it's delicious. And we read in Alma 32:42 to these Zoramites who have been cast out. And because of your diligence and your faith and your patience with the word and nourishing it, that it may take root in you, behold, by and by you shall pluck the fruit thereof, which is most precious. And again, Tzuc has meanings of preciousness as well. Which is sweet above all that is sweet, like the Tzuc that they drink. Which is white above all that is white, and pure above all that is pure. You shall feast upon this fruit. And they considered corn a fruit, and the corn plant a tree, even until you're filled, that you hunger not, neither shall you thirst, because you've had some delicious Tzuc. The point I want to make is not that the Maya stole the idea of Jesus and turned it into the maize god. It's the opposite. The Nephites move into a culture that's already existing, that has a maize god that represents all these things. And just like we saw the Quiche Maya do in the 1700s, they thought, well, that's Jesus. And I'm out of time, so I'll just say thank you. And that's it. Okay. Let's see. I'm only allowed to answer one question. Could the deity headdress correlate with the countenance passage in Alma 5? This is clearly someone that has not read my article called, I don't remember which article it's in. Is it Axis Mundi or Nephite Daykeepers? It's one of those, but absolutely yes. The glyphic inscription, when somebody wears one of these masks to transform into a god, is Ubahilan, which literally means the king receives the image of God in his countenance. And it'll have the name of the king, the name of the god. So when Alma says, have you received his image in your countenance? What he's saying is, why are you impersonating all these other gods? We know that they're idolatrous in Zarahemla at the time, because as soon as he leaves Zarahemla and goes to Gideon, he's like, oh, so nice to be here. I'm so glad you guys aren't worshiping idols like they're doing over in Zarahemla. And that is the Spaniards, when they came, they referred to those masks as their idols, because that was what transformed them into these gods and gave embodiment to them. All right, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. You're awesome.